Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in this video I'd like to continue and conclude our Cursed Founding chapter series by going into the lore for the Firehawks chapter. Every chapter that has been listed as being part of the Cursed Founding is on the list for one reason or another. Some are there due to mutations that strain the tolerance of the Inquisition, some are there being their background and origins are mysterious, others are there simply because of the bad luck that they have experienced. The Firehawks are a Space Marine chapter whose fate aligns with that last option. They had really bad luck. The chapter colors of the Firehawks were yellow, orange, and black. Their heraldry was a phoenix-like bird made of fire, and their war cry was unknown. In regards to the gene seed lineage of the chapter, they are listed as Ultramarine successors but were not acknowledged as such by the Ultramarines. This is because the defects and variations that were found in the chapter's gene seed suggest that they were other than Ultramarines. However, the Firehawks themselves would claim to be descendants of the Ultramarines still. The Firehawks were a zealous and bellicose chapter. Similar to the Black Templars, the Firehawks believed in the Emperor as a god and worshipped him fervently. This belief also made them ideologically fanatical and relentless in their duties to the Imperium. The Firehawks chapter considered its role to maintain the status quo of the Imperial Command and often focused specifically on combating traitor Imperial commanders as well as the populations under their control. It was because of this that the Firehawks became a byword for the Emperor's wrath and destruction amongst the human forces of the Imperium of Man. But it was also due to their style of war, which we'll get to later. The Firehawks chapter traditions are largely unrecorded, but amongst those held in available archives, it's understood that the chapter was feudal culturally. The titles of the chapter incorporated medieval-style rank with the standard names of Space Marine hierarchy. Titles like Captain at Arms, Knight Sergeant, Brother Ensign existed in the chapter, and the chapter master was referred to as the Grand Master. The Firehawks also fought honor duels. The blades of the weapons used in such combats were heated over ceremonial fires. While it is not said that the honor duels were to the death, they probably weren't, as the tradition was the reason why many Firehawks had horrific burn marks on their skin. It can be assumed that traditions of the chapter came from the population of the world from which they were primarily recruited, but that is now difficult to determine. The original homeworld of the Firehawks chapter was initially a world called Zoros. The little history that we have on the world is the reason why we can basically conclude that the Firehawks were not a result of the Cursed Founding and were instead raised prior to it. This is because their original homeworld was firebombed during the Wars of Apostasy in the early M36. The Wars of Apostasy happened before the so-called Cursed Founding occurred, so the Firehawks were a chapter that was created as part of the Dark Founding, if any. The Age of Apostasy was yet another example of civil war within the Imperium of Man that began in the early M36. It was largely centered on the Imperial cult, the religious belief in the Emperor as a god, and its degree of influence over the Imperium. A High Lord of Terra by the name of Vandyre would, through manipulation of belief and force, trick many in the Imperium into believing that he himself spoke with the Emperor's authority. This would lead to the Wars of Apostasy, which was divided into the Reign of Blood, during which Vandyre slaughtered anyone who rejected his rule and was in the end killed by his own bodyguards, the Daughters of the Emperor, and the Plague of Disbelief, which occurred after Vandyre's death and was a crisis of faith in the Imperium. The Firehawks contributed heavily toward Vandyre's defeat and had their homeworld firebombed by Vandyre's army, the Fraternus Templars, making it uninhabitable. The Firehawks would become a fleet-based chapter briefly, and because of their help against Vandyre, they would be given a mighty relic ship, the Raptorus Rex, by Sebastian Thor himself, the Ecclesiarch chosen to replace Vandyre. The chapter was also gifted another homeworld by the High Lords of Terra for their actions during the Great Malagantine Purge that happened around M38 in the Segmentum Tempestus. The Firehawks were one of 5 other chapters sent to enact this purge, and although information on what happened is closely guarded and hidden away in the most protected Imperial archives, we do know what happened based on scattered lore. The Firehawks, along with such chapters as the Silver Skulls and the Charnel Guard, were sent to absolutely annihilate the population of humanity that resided in the Malagantine sector because they had all turned to heresy. The objective of the chapters involved was to show no mercy and turn the population into an example of what happens when imperial worlds turn their backs to the rule of the High Lords of Terra. The Silver Skulls are an extremely superstitious chapter that only fought when they received a sign from the Emperor to do so. Though this limited them in the number of conflicts that they would actually fight, when they did fight, they fought like fanatics possessed of divine will, so they didn't have a problem fighting in the Malagantine sector purge. The Charnel Guard were Blood Angel successors that were different than most other Blood Angel successors by their appearance, but also by their practices. These are the Blood Angel successors who have a mutation in their gene seed that make the Marines of this chapter have long canine teeth like that of a vampire. They have gray death-like complexion and fully white eyes without pupils. Their role in the conflict is not gone into in detail, but as Blood Angel successors, we can imagine a great feast was had by the chapter on the populations that strayed. The Firehawks, however, were responsible for the indifferent exterminatus of several worlds within the Malagant sector. The casualties from this alone were in the millions. So frequently did they destroy worlds via exterminatus that one of the chapter's heraldries would be the mushroom cloud of an atomic bombing. It was for their outstanding participation in the Purge that they were gifted a new homeworld, Castal 11, which was a feudal world. It was also because of their outstanding participation that the chapter was thought to be one of the curse founding chapters. The Firehawks didn't really have physical flaws like some of the other supposed curse founding chapters did. It was more of their mentality and approach to war that was seen as being indicative of some sort of flaw. The Firehawks' willingness to exterminate so many worlds made many other chapters distrust them and look at them unfavorably. These views would be why Inquisitors would later suspect that the chapter was cursed. The Firehawks held a unique perspective to warfare amongst the other Astartes chapters. They were an honorable chapter and mastered many theaters of war, but they were most known for using concentrated, overwhelming force upon an enemy. They didn't believe in using overwhelming force and long-distance bombardment as an initial approach to battle, but if facing a stronger enemy, they would often withdraw from the individual conflict and strike back at the enemy with devastating firepower. Basically, they would fight fair in the beginning, but if they started losing, they would just bomb the enemy. The Firehawks did not believe in wasting the lives of its Marines pointlessly, and once they saw that the tactical advantage went to the enemy, they would withdraw rather than decrease their numbers needlessly. This would be a problem for those forces that fought alongside the Firehawks, because if the chapter's command determined that they wouldn't win the battle, the forces fighting alongside the chapter were abandoned, and without Astartes support, they were often slaughtered. This would create bad blood between the Firehawks chapter and other loyalist fighting forces. This bad blood would contribute to the idea that there was just something wrong with the Firehawks. So just to reiterate, the Firehawks had a homeworld, Zoros, that was firebombed during the Age of Apostasy. The chapter became a fleet-based chapter for some time. For their participation in the battle against Vandyre, the chapter was gifted the Raptoris Rex to be used as a fortress monastery of the chapter. After the Age of Apostasy, they participated in the Malagantine Purge and were gifted another world, Castal 11. Sometime between M38 and M40, their new homeworld was rendered uninhabitable. No information is given as to how or why this was the case, but after this, the chapter would fully assume the role of a fleet-based chapter and conduct a series of 13 crusades as part of the castigations of the Golgotha Wastes. The Firehawks would also participate in the Bedab War. They were a loyalist force in the conflict that unfortunately suffered high casualties in the initial years of the wars. They would eventually use the Raptoris Rex in the conflict to even out their odds. Still though, the chapter was significantly reduced after Bedab. In 963 M41, the Firehawks chapter fleet was leaving the Piraeus system on their way to the Crow's World subsector. They would need to travel via the warp and expected to be at their destination in only a few hours. However, the fleet, once translating into the warp, would disappear, failing to emerge from the warp at their projected location. Because of this, the Firehawks were considered a lost chapter, and the Bell of Lost Souls on Terra was rung 1,000 times, one for each Marine of the Firehawks chapter that was lost. There are conflicting stories about what happened to the Firehawks chapter, and there is a strong and somewhat persistent theory that the Firehawks chapter would eventually become the ghostly Astartes organization known as the Legion of the Damned. So we are going to try to sift through all the information available to create a somewhat accurate account. First, according to available information, there were 5 known and listed ships in the Firehawks fleet. The Raptorus Rex, which was the Star Fortress, the Absolute, which was a battle barge, the Red Harbinger, which was a strike cruiser, the Slaughtering Star, which was another strike cruiser, and the Ravage, which was a destroyer-class escort ship. According to available information, before the Firehawks fleet disappeared, the fleet was composed of the Raptorus Rex and 5 other ships, but only 4 of those 5 ships is listed as being part of the fleet, which means 2 things. First, there was another ship, likely another escort ship, that was part of the fleet that is not listed in the chapter's information, and that it's likely that the entire chapter was present in the Piraeus system, which means the entire chapter translated into the warp. It is said that around 800 battle brothers of the Firehawks chapter and 2,000 personnel were lost in the warp with the fleet. If there were only 800 Marines instead of 1,000, it is likely due to the previous casualties that the chapter faced. We know that the Firehawks suffered significant depletion during the Badab War, with their numbers being reduced to 22% by the 3rd year of the conflict. They may have been able to rebuild their numbers in the nearly 50 years between the Badab War and their disappearance, but not to the standard amount. It takes 50 years to create a chapter, so it makes sense that they couldn't rebuild their chapter fully by the time of their disappearance. Though on one hand, the chapter was said to be lost in the warp in its entirety, there is lore stating that at least 200 Marines of the Firehawks chapter actually survived being lost in the warp and themselves became the Legion of the Damned. Here is where the conflict lies in the lore, and we have to look deeper to understand how this connects. There are essentially 3 clues that reveal the truth of what happened to the Firehawks chapter: the space coffins, the banner, and the flight recorder. In 986 M41, standard Imperial patrols through an Orc-held territory revealed the marks of devastation in those areas without any information or visual on the attacking force. This would become a common sight amongst patrol forces in the area. In 987 M41, a year later, a patrol ship in the Moran subsector would nearly collide with a mysterious ship that was leaving the subsector. The departing ship left behind 2 space coffins, which were retrieved by the patrol ship and sent to Terra for investigation. The coffins were opened by the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and they found the deceased and decayed bodies of 2 space marines inside. They could not tell the chapter from looking at their armor, so it was in some way different than what it was before. The Mechanicus actually had to identify the armor's serial numbers and trace them back to the chapter that issued them. Based on the serial numbers, the armor of both Marines belonged to the Firehawks chapter, which means the 2 Marines were part of the Firehawks chapter. 1 year later, in 988 M41, a research station was attacked by Orc pirates, and those at the research station were nearly all killed until the Orcs were attacked from the rear by a mysterious power-armored force. In moments, the Orcs were destroyed and the Marines were gone, but the Marines had left a banner. The banner belonged to the Firehawks chapter and had the phrase "For the Emperor Beyond the Point of Death" on it. The Marines also left behind a flight recorder and other sealed documents. All of these items were sent to Terra for investigation. After going through the information on the recorder, it was discovered that the flight recorder was that of the Absolute, the battle barge of the Firehawks chapter, one of the ships said to have been lost in the warp. The flight recorder, along with the accompanying documents, told the true story of what happened to the chapter. According to the information on the flight recorder, the Absolute battle barge was one of the ships that had translated into the warp as part of the Firehawks fleet when it disappeared into the warp. According to it, after translating into the warp, the fleet encountered particularly strong warp storms, which compromised the integrity of their fleet's Geller fields. The ships were suddenly boarded by demonic entities. The Firehawks were forced to fight for their lives, and one by one, the ships began to disintegrate, becoming part of the warp itself. The captain of the Absolute was shown to have dared an escape from the warp, successfully translating back into real space. The recorder logged that the location of the Absolute was to the far east, to the fringes of the galaxy beyond even the light of the Astronomicon, thousands of light years off course. This information confirmed that the entire fleet was not lost to the warp. The Absolute was able to translate back into real space. As we said earlier, the Absolute was a battle barge, and battle barges can carry up to 3 companies of Space Marines with tactical assets. So that's 300 Marines. If you combine this with the fact that the chapter itself was not at full strength, this lends credibility to the lore, which says that at least 200 Marines survived the warp incident. The Marines aboard the Absolute were faced with multiple dire situations at once. Not only were they thousands of light years off course outside the boundary of the Imperium, they were also the only remaining survivors of their chapter, because the Gene Seed and recruits of the Firehawks were on the Raptorus Rex when it was destroyed in the warp. To make matters worse, due to their exposure to the raw elements of the warp, the survivors of the chapter were physically mutated by it. Within solar months, the Marines' skin began to blacken and blister and show signs of decay. Their mental state began to descend into insanity due to the pain and agony of their living decomposition. Though, due to their indoctrination as Space Marines and their faith in the Emperor, they were not corrupted morally and remained loyal to the Imperium. Because they didn't have a navigator or any human serfs left, and not wanting to risk warp translation again, it would take years for the chapter to navigate itself back within the boundary of the Imperium. During this time, at least half of the survivors succumbed to the warp malady that they were experiencing. It was also during this time that the remaining Marines of the chapter would remove the heraldry of the Firehawks from their armor, instead adopting the skull or death's head as their heraldry, a symbol that was used in the chapter previously. They would paint their armor black with flame details in certain places. The mentality of the chapter would become fatalistic. They only wanted to die, and they would all eventually die due to their warp-influenced decomposition. But until then, they wanted to continue serving the Imperium and the Emperor. When the Absolute made its way back within the boundary of the Imperium, the remaining Firehawks would use the Emperor's turret to guide them as to where they should deploy. However, because of the nature of their warp contagion, they isolated themselves from other Imperial forces so as not to spread it to them. This is how the Firehawks became known as the Legion of the Damned. But this is not an identity that they put on themselves. The Firehawks chapter never stopped calling themselves Firehawks, but they did become a part of the Legion of the Damned. To understand what I mean by this, we have to talk about the Legion of the Damned. The Legion of the Damned is a mysterious chapter of Space Marines seemingly composed of ghost Space Marines. These spectral Astartes have been seen to appear on the battlefield out of nowhere to aid Imperial forces. In appearance, damned legionnaires are often set ablaze by a psychic fire. Their black armor is covered with symbols of bones, skeletons, and skulls, and they are often invulnerable to physical attack, with enemy weapons fire passing through them. Unhelmed damned legionnaires are said to have pale, sunken complexion, and after assistance is given, the Marines of the Damned Legion disappear without a trace. The Legion of the Damned began as a myth largely born from the surviving loyalist legions of the Horus Heresy. Many Astartes believed in the Legion of the Damned and the idea that the Emperor's warriors would return for vengeance against the enemy from even beyond the grave. Some Space Marine librarians have the belief that they are a psychic manifestation of collective hope, or a consensual hallucination, as Marines of the Damned Legion can never be caught, tracked, or remembered for very long. The Legion of the Damned started off as a myth. And then, due to the belief in them, they became a true psychic phenomena, with humanity being a minor psychic species and able to do that kind of thing. But then, they became real, meaning actual Space Marine chapters began to be seen as the Legion of the Damned, with the first and foremost being the Firehawks. We already went over the Firehawks and how their chapter color scheme was changed to be very similar to that of the Legion of the Damned. If seen on the battlefield, it is easy to see why they would be misunderstood as the Legion of the Damned. But a key difference between them and the Legion is that the Firehawks can, and actually did, die. In fact, because the surviving Firehawks were last recorded existing at the end of the 41st millennium and we are currently in the 42nd millennium, by the current timeline, the surviving Firehawks chapter have all succumbed to the warp contagion that they were inflicted with and no longer exist. Another difference is that the Firehawks are not set aflame by psychic fire. The Flame Falcons were, but they as a chapter were mostly destroyed a century after they were created, way before certain events in which they were witnessed. Still though, it is a possibility that some of them survived and fought until they were destroyed completely, which means, for example, it could have been the Flame Falcons fighting beside the Invaders chapter during the Doom of Idhare, instead of the Legion of the Damned. After all, the Marines that fought beside the Invaders in the destruction of the Eldari craft world were covered in flames, like the Legion of the Damned are described to be. The Firehawks, on the other hand, had fire symbols painted onto their armor rather than being covered in actual psychic fire. There is a story about a squad of Firehawks going into the warp to rescue one of their captains from Nurgle's mansion itself. In the story, the Firehawks were covered in a psychic flame that purified their surroundings and destroyed many of Nurgle's servants. The squad was successful in retrieving their captain, but the captain had been infected with Nurgle's rot underneath his armor, and so when they left the warp, it spread. According to the lore, this happened in 965 M41, which would place this occurrence 2 years after the chapter was lost in the warp. I question the validity of this story as it does not fit with the existing timeline of events, but it's only fair that I mention it in this video. So, in regards to the true fate of the Firehawks chapter, the majority of the chapter was lost to the warp. However, one of the ships as part of the fleet, the Absolute Battle Barge, was able to translate back into real space. However, it translated outside the boundary of the Imperium. Not only that, but the Marines aboard the Absolute were infected with a warp contagion that made them decompose. So they were living and decomposing at the same time. Now, as the chapter, or the survivors of the chapter, traveled back to the Imperium, into the boundaries of the Imperium, half of the Marines that were infected with the warp contagion passed away. But when they arrived back into the Imperium, by that time they had painted their armor black with fire symbols, and they had used the Emperor's turret to fight in certain locations or to guide where they were to fight. And when they were seen as the Legion of the Damned. They were not necessarily the Legion of the Damned, but they had the appearance and they behaved similar to the Legion of the Damned. Now, because of the warp contagion, those survivors who had survived thus far are probably gone now, which means that the Firehawks chapter exists no more. However, the Legion of the Damned and the myth of the Legion of the Damned persists even to this day. In regards to whether or not the Firehawks were one of the chapters that was created as part of the Cursed Founding, as I've said previously in the Lamenters video, bad luck does not make a chapter cursed. They did not have any recognizable gene seed flaws, and any rumor that they did stems from their high regard toward their own lives rather than physical genetic mutations. They are not taller than regular Astartes, therefore they are not a Cursed Founding chapter, nor are they subjects of the Homo sapiens Novus Project. The Firehawks claimed to be descended from the Ultramarines. However, the Ultramarines did not claim the chapter, as their gene seed showed deviations from the Ultramarines' standard gene seed pattern. If the Firehawks were a successor of another chapter or another legion, I think it would be the Dark Angels. Both because of their traditions as being a feudal chapter, their belief in the Emperor as a god, but also for their love of bombing enemies and using exterminatus as a way of eliminating enemies, which is very similar to what the Dark Angels Legion would do during the Horus Heresy. And that was my video on the Firehawks chapter. I hope that you all enjoyed that and learned something new. I also hope that you enjoyed this Cursed Founding series. I really had fun really deep diving into these chapters. The Cursed Founding is one of my favorite founding, partially because it just doesn't exist. It never happened, but also because it allows people to like actually do some inquisitorial research into Space Marine chapters and uncover all of these secret informations and truths. And I thought that was cool. With all that being said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.